The fact is this, we went to Afghanistan 20 years ago, and we went because we were attacked on 9/11. And we went to take on those who had attacked us on 9/11 and to make sure that Afghanistan would not again become a haven for terrorism directed at the United States or any of our allies and partners. And we achieved the objectives that we set out to achieve. Al-Qaeda has been significantly degraded. Its capacity to conduct an attack against the United States now from Afghanistan is not there. And of course, Osama bin Laden was brought to justice 10 years ago. So the president felt that as we're looking at the world now, we have to look at it through the prism of 2021, not 2001.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. That was U.S. Secretary of State Blinken justifying a decision to pull out the last U.S. troops from Afghanistan. And he's putting a good face on what may be a very bad decision. There are not many people I can say as a TV correspondent I flew with them in a Black Hawk helicopter across the mountains of Afghanistan to forward operating bases where American soldiers fought to capture or kill insurgents. Major General Jeffrey Schloesser was the commanding general in charge of the 101st Airborne in eastern Afghanistan. And during our journey through a war zone, I think he was thoughtful, sincere, and completely frank about combating a surge in violence and the U.S. strategy to win the war. That was in 2008. And now in 2021, the year the U.S. administration ends the American troop presence in Afghanistan, General Schloesser has written a book in which he predicts abandoning Afghanistan now won't end well for Afghans or for Americans. But he says the war, despite everything, in the end was worth it. Jeff Schloesser is a retired Major General who commanded the 101st Airborne. 15 months of that command was in Afghanistan, and he is the author of a new book called Marathon War. And he joins me now. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Dana. How are you today?
I'm very well, and thanks for talking to us about this. It's a great book. The curtain is closing on that war, and you wrote it was worth it. Was it really?
Great question, Dan. And it's one that I think we're going to continue to, grapple with over the next decade. We went in there to do a very specific thing in the first year, which was really to bring justice on those that attacked our country in 9/11. And what we found out is that as we pushed out Al-Qaeda and either captured or killed them or gave them a chance to reconcile, that what we found there was a land that was a potential, not only was it a failed state, but it was a safe haven. And so we had to stay longer. And the question of it is now as we withdraw, did we stay long enough?
You ended with a warning. If we let that country go back to those who would destroy us in our way of life, it will not be long, certainly not a generation, before they come looking for us again.
Yes. In Marathon War, I say basically that, we can turn our back, we can forget Afghanistan, but Afghanistan will not forget us. And I truly still believe that. The area there is so important to our national interests, but it's also, as I said, it's now going to, in my mind, be a failed state. And if that actually happens, they'll come to see us again.
You think it's going to crumble, that the Afghan army will not hold, that the Afghan government will not stick like glue? Not that it has anyway, but you feel pretty dire about how this is going to unfold once U.S. forces and NATO forces and other contributing countries are out of there.
I think that, the United States and NATO, our allies there, as well as all the other countries that have participated over the last 20 years, have been the backbone for Afghanistan. It is still a country that it's not used to having a centralized government. It's a tribal country. The economy is still, after literally trillions of years, it is not unified. And there's a level of corruption there that is just incredibly difficult for most Westerners to understand. The answer is yes. I do believe that there will be a civil war. It may not be tomorrow or the next year or 2 years from now before the country begins, in a sense, to crumble, as you said. But I believe within 5 years' time, we'll find ourselves with a completely failed state and a safe haven again for those that want to attack us.
It's really tragic. I mean, I'm kind of jumping ahead in the book a little bit, but I know you refer to some of these little school girls who were sprayed with acid when you were in command there, and that took place in Kandahar, I think.
It did.
Some of them blinded, some of them couldn't go back to school, and that was the intention of the attackers. It kind of breaks my heart that, I mean, along with the fight, American soldiers really struggled in those patrols that we were on to go into towns and villages and open schools and open roads and try to get healthcare clinics rolling. And part of the good news were kids flying kites. Excuse my romanticism, but kids flying kites, which were banned under the Taliban, kids being allowed to go to school, girls being educated, starting to take a part in that society. And all of that now potentially rolls back.
I am deeply concerned about the human rights issue that I think we were going to see over the next several years. And you're absolutely right, Dana. You know, when we first went to that country, very few children actually went to school. It's less than 1 million. As we left it, it's more, I think it's 4 times that now, with more than half of them being women or females. That potentially is all going to be lost. And, you know, the last photo of that book, I specifically chose to be the last photo. And it's a young soldier from CJTF 101, one of our assigned troops. But anyway, he is actually giving some food to some young children, and they're laughing. And it wasn't staged; this was totally caught on camera in the middle of a combat zone. And it's all about the children. And I am deeply worried about the children of Afghanistan.
You talk about, you know, the goals of the strategic plan for the war on terrorism, and you know something about that because you wrote in the book that you were part of the group to publish the nation's first operational strategic plan for the war on terrorism, and that you actually briefed President Bush on the plan. What was the goal? What was the headline?
Well, the first goal was obviously to, you know, secure Afghanistan so it would never attack us again. The rest of the story, though, was to actually do that. In those days, what we thought would be necessary is that you had to secure not only against the enemy, or the insurgents or the terrorists, but you had to secure the people, make them feel like they could actually get up in the morning, work for a decent wage, and send their kids to school, and then also to link them to their government. So really, 3 broad goals: security, basically, economic development that led to jobs. And then education and medical improvements. And then finally, linking all that back to a government that the Afghans could trust.
That didn't go well, that last part, definitely. But look, you draw some interesting parallels with Vietnam as well. And your father, he served in Vietnam?
He served 3 tours in Vietnam, yes.
And he never, you said in the book, never forgave politicians for walking away. Do you forgive politicians walking away today? You mentioned that the generals will be ultimately blamed, so you better have big shoulders. And you also talked about the fact that, you know, they made the mistake of trying to hold everything rather than what was achievable in Vietnam. Did we just do the same in Afghanistan? Sorry, that's a big question.
That's a great question, Dan, and I think it's going to be explored over the next couple of years. But I think that if you look in the horizon, that's what it looks like. You know, I mean, in a sense, the parallels between Afghanistan and Vietnam are really close. I mean, in some cases, you know, there was a government that was fairly corrupt, unclear how much, you know, it had been elected, how much it was supported by the people. There was a very strong insurgent group that was, you know, pushing them. And then you had, you know, the United States and our allies. We forget that we fought with many allies in Vietnam. And when we left, and then finally 2 years later, when we dropped all basically budget support, of financial support, it was no longer possible for that South Vietnamese government to basically survive. And essentially, what I hope does not happen, but it could. And unfortunately, I'm almost predicting that it might over, you know, 5 years' time, is the same thing in Afghanistan.
You were told in deployment you had to succeed in 2 theaters of operations, Afghanistan and Pakistan. The latter was very gray, was it not? I mean, were there clear, you know, orders to go forward into Pakistan, or you kind of had to flirt along the border with Pakistan and sometimes carry out a drone strike in hot pursuit?
Absolutely gray area. The guidance that we received was fairly clear from my boss at the time, General McKiernan. And yet most of the U.S. structure did not exist. I make a point in Marathon War that I went to Pakistan with, my staff several times. And over a period of time, we started with a terrible relationship. They were basically supporting insurgent attacks across our border, and we had a very bad relationship, military to military, with them. I think over 15 months, as I write about Marathon War, I felt at the end of it that we had made huge progress. Obviously, it was not enough.
And you blame the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence agency, as playing a double game.
I absolutely do. In fact, I often think that many of the senior military officers that I dealt with from Pakistan actually didn't know the level that this ISI directorate was playing within their own country as well as within Afghanistan. So I can't point my finger to them, but it's very clearly it had support at the very highest levels of Pakistan.
Yeah, and you make an interesting point in there, because we often kind of say Pakistan does this, or Pakistan didn't do this, or Pakistan's playing a double game. But in fact, you made the case that it was pretty tough on the military, probably on the front lines of the border in Pakistan, because they weren't quite sure, who had their back and who had a knife in their back.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's easy for us in the West and America to forget that this was actually a frontier. Winston Churchill, I mentioned in Marathon War that one of my favorite books was The Malaccan Field Force by Winston Churchill, Lieutenant Winston Churchill, who served in that area back in those days. It was just as much a frontier in the northwestern portions of Pakistan then as it is today, basically. And so they did not have all control as far as the U.S. Or the Pakistani military, for sure. It was there were several double games being played in that area. I dare say it's the same right now.
I was, in Afghanistan a dozen different times, and I always used to hear, and it became cliche to some extent, that, the spring comes, the bad guys come over the mountains from Pakistan, the Taliban, they carry out their attacks. Winter comes, the number of attacks go down again, and they retreat back into the frontier lands of Pakistan. But I remember flying in a helicopter with you over Afghanistan, and you said, it's not quite clear to me that it quite operates that way. It's more complex than that. They smuggle weapons through the winter. They stock weapons ready for the spring. Some of them melt back into the local populations. And that is probably a much more realistic take on what was happening. And then you talk a lot about what happened in, and forgive me for the pronunciation, Wanat.
Yes. Yeah. So for an example, well, Dan, first of all, I treasure those times flying there with you. That was actually, if you recall, it was a stunningly beautiful day, and what a great way to see it by helicopter. Afghanistan is a land of contrast, beautiful, and yet in many ways it can be horribly difficult to be able to survive in that country. Well, I tell you, let's go to Wanat for an example. There were several lessons learned. It's still one of the most studied stories in the U.S. Military, for sure. The lessons that most of us learned there is that whether it was the winter, whether it was the late spring and the snows and stuff like that, but the enemy gets a vote, and they can fight well as well, and they can figure out ways to get around most of the things that we regard as military advantages in the West or in the U.S. Army. And they did so in that fight. I every day I wake up and think about those soldiers that were killed and those that were horribly wounded. They fought with a great honor, but the enemy fought fairly well too. And it was just it's just an example of how good that unit was, that they actually, the U.S. And the Afghans and the few Marines that were over there, that they actually were able to fight that back and overall hold that day.
What makes that battle different? This is July 2008. 9 U.S. soldiers die in an attack by roughly 100 Taliban. There are a couple of dozen more, I think about 20 more U.S. soldiers wounded. And you write that it is there are few battles as bloody and heroic.
Yeah. So, for Afghanistan, I think that 20 years of drudgery, going out and patrolling, coming on back, getting a rocket attack, maybe somebody else being hurt via that way, that can just lead to this idea that there was no great heroism in Afghanistan. In fact, there were several battles. This was the one most notable where, these soldiers fought and fought and fought against almost all odds, and certainly against, they were definitely outnumbered. And that's what makes that one, I think, a little bit special. I mean, there's no doubt about it that, the amount of awards, medals, and things that came out of that for heroism is absolutely incredible for the 20 years of Afghanistan that we've seen.
But you wrote this was well planned, and that the enemy was probably well entrenched in that village, and that the village worked with them and assisted them. This wasn't just a case of insurgents coming across the mountain.
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, and that's where we got it wrong. I mean, there's no doubt that we made the wrong decisions about what we thought was possible in that village. We actually thought we were going to insert, following counterinsurgency doctrine at the time, get right inside the villagers and help them do those three things. I mean, help secure them, help link them to the government, and then help economically. Gosh, did we get it wrong? And that caused me to, Dana, to take a hard look at everything else we were doing for the remainder of the 12 months that we stayed there in Afghanistan, look most of with a jaded view into every village and every site that we had to just see, did it make any sense for us to be there?
A bit like Vietnam. And maybe this was the bellwether attack, where kind of that coin approach where you go in, you spend some money, you help the locals, you try to win hearts and minds, and eventually they'll turn and push the Taliban out. I mean, increasingly, that wasn't the first village that became like that, was it?
No, I mean, in fact, I mean, it, as you said, it may be in the bellwether, maybe in one of the first, but it happened several times thereafter over the following 10 years up until now. And I think, sometimes we can be accused. And in fact, I talk about it in the Marathon War about, did we fight this war 1 year at a time? In other words, a unit would come in, spend 12 to 15 months there, and then shift out. And then you'd have to relearn everything, and including the relationships with the locals, which, sometimes could be very unclear. I still wonder about that. When I left there and when I wrote the book, I did not think that was the case. I think we tried very hard to study and learn from our predecessors. But, the more I think about it and the more I, look at some of the errors that we made in a war of this nature, that could still be one of the things that are out there.
You spoke of the enemy running rat lines. Can you tell me what were rat lines through that area, and why didn't you stay? Because as a commander, and I know you've been asked this before, but I'll ask you again. I mean, in the end, you closed down that base and you withdrew. Didn't that send the wrong message?
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. And, I think I mentioned in Marathon War, it was a strategic decision at the time. I thought it was the right thing to do. But what I did do is I gave a strategic media win to the Taliban
But you knew that they were going to fire that. You knew that they were going to trumpet that.
I absolutely did. Yeah. And I think that, over time that was not the decision I should have made. I mean, I think over time, did it make sense to stay in that village? No. Did it make sense to try to help those villagers who had basically, they left, gave that village on over to the insurgents, and only later did they come back? Didn't make any sense to me to be able to try to work on our counterterrorism strategy or our counterinsurgency, because I didn't think it would win. But when you make a choice of that nature, when you make a strategic choice, you really have got to weigh, what are the options, and then think, a year in the future, think about 2 years in the future. And I think, it's funny, when I was at Harvard, I took a course called Thinking in Time. Great book out there, by the way. I probably didn't learn the lesson of thinking in time. I should have thought 2 to 3 years later and thought about how that would impact our strategic stance inside of Afghanistan.
You think it was a mistake to leave?
It was a mistake. Yeah, I made a mistake there. And, it's probably one, just in life, Dana, you learn things and, for 3 or 4 years, you think you made the right choice. A decade later, when you look at it, sometimes you make some choices that are almost strategic in your life. And this one was strategic in the, stance for the United States and our allies in Afghanistan.
Well, Jeff, you know what? I mean, you're right. It'll be debated for years. And there's probably 50% class of commanders that would say, get the hell out because it wasn't defendable. And given limited resources, you should have left, and you made the right decision. And maybe there would have been another 9 soldiers killed in another attack there. And then there are those that will take that longer view and say, well, we don't want to be seen to be giving up ground. But, I like your book because you speak, and I like you more after reading it because you speak about heroism, which we always hear about soldiers holding ground and charging the hill, and 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 I don't mean to in any way underestimate those great acts of valor, but you also speak of character and how important character is as a leader. And I think for any leader, this is a great book to read. Just, whether you're a soldier or you're just any kind of a leader, even in corporate business, about character. But in the end, I didn't realize until I got to the end of your book, and it made me a bit sad today, that you decided to leave the Army over that attack at the end because others were held responsible. And you felt in the end, you were at the top of the chain of command and you should bear ultimate responsibility for what happened there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, Dana. I mean, when I left, and even today, I wake up in the morning and I miss being a soldier, and I miss, leading soldiers. And I think I say in Marathon War there that it was, the most rewarding part of my entire professional career. I definitely felt, though, that when I came back from Afghanistan and found out that, 3 subordinate commanders who were actually, one of them was awarded a Silver Star for heroism that day, the company commander, but they were being held, for dereliction of duty. And I felt that was absolutely wrong. And I am a big believer in taking total responsibility, especially as a commander in combat, for everything that happens below me, whether it's good, bad, or whatever. The good, I try to help make people feel good about it themselves, push that to them, but the bad has to come to the commander. And I made that point several different times to the senior leaders in the United States Army, as well as at Central Command. At the end of the day, I felt like as that pursued on, I had to actually make a statement, and the only way to really do that was to choose to retire. And I still do not regret that decision at all. I do believe at the end of the day that the most important part of being a leader is actually character, and I felt I had to show some by doing that.
Well, you showed a lot, and I think it's important to note that you were cleared by those investigations, and you would have probably gone on to be promoted and maybe be commanding in Europe, U.S. forces. So you didn't talk character. You backed it up and showed it with ultimate decisions. But I wanted to ask you about General McKiernan, who lost support of Washington and was replaced at one point. Do you think that it was fair that generals, again, we come back to this, the generals were blamed for the fight when they were constantly saying they were under-resourced and underfunded? And then I'll ask you about that because a lot of people will debate that.
Yeah. Well, so what I will say is, in my belief, and is that, generals will be held responsible in almost every war or every kind of incident like war, even less war conflict. And rightly so. This is our profession, and these are things that we spend years and years learning about. We must, though, you must always understand. I think that at very high levels, it is politicians and our Congress that decides whether you're going to actually support a endeavor of this nature, whether it's war or whether it's a minor conflict and stuff like that. And so we go hand in hand. And should generals be blamed? Absolutely. Do I take responsibility for my portion? Absolutely. I sure do. But just as we see now, this is a political decision for us to withdraw our troops. And at the time when we served, there was a political decision to underfund, as far as resources, Afghanistan, so that the Iraq and the Iraqi surge could be supported. It was my responsibility to call that out. And eventually I had to do it publicly, if you recall. I mean, I told you what I was saying as we would fly, that I was going public as far as a need for more resources. And that takes also a little bit of character. It takes a little bit of moral courage, which I talk about in Marathon War too. It's not always popular to ask for more when your area is not regarded as the number one priority.
And you were briefing, you just weren't talking to reporters. I mean, you were briefing a young senator named Barack Obama, and then you were also briefing the president at the time, President Bush, and you write about that in the book. But, in the end, when you read, I went back and read it because sometimes Iraq and Afghanistan kind of melds together on some of these numbers, but 800 billion in US spent in Afghanistan, at one point more than 100,000 troops deployed. Is that really under-resourcing?
At the time when we were there weren't that many troops, and I will say that, nor were the financial resources there. Over time, we did put that in, and I think it's right for American people and people that are interested in national security to say, well, at what point was that enough? I think somewhere along the line there must have been enough troops. I think the biggest issue for that is, if you look back in time, is that we chose to make a different choice within about 2 years' time, and we started to withdraw troops to a fairly significant level. We still continued to support financially for a very long time Afghanistan, and there's literally been now trillions put into Afghanistan. I think it's a really great question to sit there and look and say, when is enough in a conflict like this, where it's not our number one nation's priority, especially now, and yet it still is important. It's a national security interest, and what do you need? Do you need to be at war, and do you need to withdraw, and are those the only choices that you have in your spectrum? Because General Petraeus, for instance, will tell you that any place you leave a gap or a vacuum right now in the war of terror, it will be filled by extremism, and you will dangerously harvest the result of that down the road. So we keep troops in North Africa. We keep special forces all over the world. Why wouldn't we keep a minimal force in Afghanistan? There's only 2,500 soldiers there right now. So it's not like this big force contingent, nothing like what you commanded at the time. Why wouldn't we keep 2,500 soldiers on the ground training Afghan forces, forward air controllers, helping them at some point carry out airstrikes if they have to defend the government? Well, I think that a lot of people are asking that question right now, especially those that have worked or been in Afghanistan and reported on Afghanistan. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, look, for national security interest, we still have troops in Germany, in Japan, in Korea, in places that much lesser troops, but in places that are still important to us. JTF Bravos in Honduras. How many Americans know that we have a couple thousand troops down there and have had for decades? We do this around the world when our national interests are actually, considered important in that area of the world. I would also say, Dana, people ought to take a hard look at Afghanistan and try to find it on a map. If China's a priority to us, what country do we have troops in right now that actually butts up to China on a land base? It's Afghanistan. What country is located in between Iran, which is a national security priority for us, and then, of course, our pending or our upcoming allies in India and nuclear-powered states like Afghanistan or Pakistan and India? It's Afghanistan. It is a strategically important place, and much less the counterterrorism issues.
In Iraq, draw a parallel with Iraq, because we left Iraq, and then suddenly ISIS moved in, took over the north, took over Mosul, where you were based earlier in your career in Iraq, established a caliphate. And in the end, U.S. forces are back, and NATO forces had to go back in there, and the British, the French, bombing missions. And this may be very short term, this bringing American troops home from Afghanistan.
We'll see. Iraq's one example of what happens, the attack on the second largest city, Mosul, one that we know, and that is, thousands and thousands of years old. Or is the example, and we chose to come back in because of the nature of that. Or could it be like Vietnam, where we just, we basically shake our hands and said, at the end of Vietnam, we said, okay, we're done. And, and 2 years later, it was absolutely, was invaded by North Vietnamese conventional divisions. I don't know which parallel to follow. I don't know which example is going to happen. I do know, though, it's going to be important for America.
Jeff, last word to you on Afghanistan and your book. I've tried to lead you through it a little bit, and it's a good read, and I think you begin to understand as a reader that conflict and how tricky it was. And I was moved by a lot of the moments in there, such as ramp ceremonies, where your book is peppered with these moments where American soldiers who have been killed in battle are honored at a ramp ceremony on an aircraft before flowing home with the American flag and with soldiers who served along with them. By the way, we were not allowed to cover those ramp ceremonies under the Bush administration because they didn't want us to show American losses. And in the end, I think we showed a Canadian ramp ceremony because we had to talk about losses. But there was always this PR effort that was going on. Are we winning? Are we losing? And oversimplistic views on how the Afghan war was being fought and what was victory. And I think in the end, it was going to be a 20-year counterinsurgency fight. And a lot of people knew that, certainly in the military. I don't know if the politicians ever did. But last word to you. Sorry.
What's funny about the ramp ceremony is that those were some of the most memorable times of my life, and yet the most challenging to get through. I mean, we lost 180 soldiers and Marines, sailors, and airmen while we were there, including also some civilians from our intelligence agencies. And almost each and every day or night, we would have a ramp ceremony for those to honor them. And people would come out from all over. Most of them were at Bagram Airfield. They would come out, and whether it was 2:00 in the morning, they'd line the streets as a Humvee with a coffin would go by to take it to the ceremony itself. And war is not a bloodless effort. War, if it's important enough for people to put their national treasure in it, you're going to have some losses. But you have to honor the people that served there. Just like right now, as we get ready to leave Afghanistan, let's not leave all those people that actually gave their time, their selfless service. In some cases, they gave the last full measure of their life. Let's not forget them.
And there was not another attack on America while U.S. forces were on the ground there.
There's not been.
Jeff Schloesser, retired Major General, commanded the 101st Airborne. Read the book Marathon War. And Jeff, thank you so much for your time.
And Dana, thanks for the time this morning.
And that's our backstory on Afghanistan. What a complex puzzle American commanders faced fighting insurgents and corruption in the Afghan government, and challenges of a drug trade linked to terrorist networks that hit and then ran and struck again, killing civilians and soldiers with no regard for lives lost. The Taliban carried out those attacks, and Al-Qaeda, and ISIS too. Afghan warlords all vied for power but were reluctant to disarm and work together in a united Afghan government. Stir in Iran and Pakistan and others, and it's no wonder the war lasted 20 years. And as U.S. and allied Western countries pull out, the war won't stop. The Taliban will try to dominate and rule the country, as the Mujahideen did after the Russians left Afghanistan in 1989. Chaos followed the Russian pullout. And I wish I was wrong, but it's sure to follow this American one too. Thanks for listening to Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.